It's all funny and good when we say in permaculture or in general water cycle restoration, slow water down, we need to spread it, we need to soak it. But what does it mean? What does slow mean? Is it 1 kilometer per hour or is it 10? How do we measure these things? How do we quantify? It's definitely possible to manage this through observation if you only manage a few hectares or acres, if you're there many decades, or even different generations. Of course you can observe this. But as soon as you start talking about regeneration at a much larger scale, a landscape scale, we need numbers and models. Surprisingly, a lot of this is already possible. You can calculate to a relatively detailed degree what certain flows of air, water and moisture will look like in a landscape, meaning you can start to calculate and start to imagine almost to a parcel level where you need to regenerate in order to restore, for instance, summer rains in the Mediterranean or year-round rivers. But what's more surprising is that hardly anybody is doing this. Today we have the pleasure to have one of the very few people that comes from an engineering background, loves modeling, used to be in the military and went deep into permaculture and now regeneration in general, and is putting numbers to these questions. What is slow? How much do we need to regenerate? How much do we need to restore in a certain landscape to have a chance of restoring, to trigger rains, to restore rivers, etc.? Warning, this is early. This is an emerging practice where we put numbers to these philosophically perfectly sounding questions like slow water down and spread and soak it. But how much water? And for example, where globally do we have the biggest potential? The biggest gap between the forest and water potential and the current situation on the ground? This and much more we cover in the conversation of today. This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, Investing as if the planet mattered, where we talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land and our sea, grow our food, what we eat, where and consume. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. To make it easy for fans to support our work, we launched our membership community, and so many of you have joined us as a member. Thank you. If our work created value for you, and if you have the means, and only if you have the means, consider joining us. Find out more on gumroad.com/investing-in-regenag. That is gumroad.com/investing-in-regenag, or find the link below. Welcome to another episode, today with an engineer who's deep into permaculture and loves modeling, but not the catwalk kind of thing. Welcome, Ali.
Hi, Cohen. How are you?
Now, this is definitely the modeling that happens behind the screen and with a lot of computing power. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. This is a deep one this is going to be a deep one on water cycles, modeling, calculations, and how to approach restoration at a water cycle scale. But first of all, a question I always love to ask to kick it off and to understand, and in this case, it's super appropriate as well. What led you to such a specific piece of the, let's say, regeneration movement? Like, you're one of the few people, I think, that's modeling water cycles, and it's calculating where what could happen and how much needs to happen before rains come back, before rivers stabilize, etc. But this is a very specific career path, let's say. What led you to this, and how come you spend most of your awake hours thinking about water cycles and restoration?
So I started permaculture. I was introduced to permaculture in 2012. Before that, I was working in a defense setup in Pakistan. And anyway, I left that job. And
so you were an engineer first, permaculture second.
Yeah,
let's say.
Yeah. So I started that, left that job, and a friend of mine asked me that let's do some farming, and it was basically more or less tunnel farming. So I told him I'll go through a course on tunnel farming, and then I'll decide whether we should be or should not be doing it. At that time, I was also doing a Greek medicine diploma, just for the sake of it, because I liked it. And I had my parents were a little bit sick, so had a little thought about it, and I told them that I'll just go through this thing, and I was doing that course as well. So by the time I finished that tunnel farming course, I told my friend that no, this is not possible. I can't spray like 36 sprays in a 3-month cycle on something as something like tomato and or cucumber crop, which is mostly eaten normally in the raw form. So I said, I can't do that. She said, what's the solution? And I said, people have been doing these kinds of things since like 5,000 years, and there must be some other way. And that's how I stumbled upon Bill Mollison. And then I did a permaculture course with Larry Kahn, and then we had a small farm. Now the problem I faced when we were doing this thing was basically my modeling. I was doing modeling when I was in the defense setup, mathematical modeling and stuff. And I was like, okay, these guys are saying things which make a lot of sense to me philosophically, but they don't make sense to me when I put them on the paper, and I can't calculate anything. So how much is how much?
Like, you mean the guys in the permaculture world? Yeah. What were things that triggered you, let's say, philosophically, and triggered your engineer brain at the same time? What were they saying at the time in terms of model, of terms of weather, etc.?
So yeah. So for example, they say slow the water, slow the flow, spread it, sink it. So I was like, okay, how much do you slow? How do you know is it slow enough?
What is slow?
What is slow? What does slow means? Is 1 kilometer per hour slow, or do I look at the land and understand slow? But even then, I had this question that okay, there's some kind of land which are like clay soils which are nearly impermeable, in the sense that like we have in Pakistan, normally we have arid soils and they are mostly clay soils, very little organic matter, and this cropping over centuries have basically taken away all the cropping, all the organic matter from the soils. So they are like very hard when it rains. Water flows over them. So for them, slow doesn't mean anything. Even if I just reduce the slope to like 2 degrees, even then the water is enough to flow over all of the land and not even permeate the first one foot of the soil. And this actually was a problem when we were doing it. We would see the water flowing over the land, and when we would dig the soil the next day after the rainfall, the water would permeate only the first 3 or 4 inches.
Wow.
And there was a very interesting thing. Just beside our land, there was an underground water channel which I could see because of the reeds growing on the outskirts. And I was telling my partner that there is water under this rock under this soil, and he was like, "There's no water because this is an extremely dry place." I said, "These plants tell me this thing." So we had a bet, and I just dug that soil, and lo and behold, we had like a raging river under 3 feet, and the plants couldn't reach there. So my question was basically, so how slow? And when you have slowed the water, then what do you do? What does it mean by organic matter? How much do I dig inside? What's the appropriate level for maximum productivity for a plant? How much do I dig? And questions like this. Similarly, when we're making compost, I had the question, okay, what's the exact mixture? How can I make it a mixture that I can just teach my 7-year-old and tell him, okay, just take this much and just mix it together. Don't worry about anything else.
And what was the reaction to those questions? Like when you post those questions in your permaculture course or afterward, what was the response?
It was mostly that it's sort of like an intuitive process. You just keep on looking at the land, understand the land. The land will tell you what it wants, and you can just work it out, which makes sense in a farm because you're always in a farm and you can actually do it. But once we started moving, this was like 3 years ago, I met Steve Boniwell. He had developed a technique known as maximum infiltration, a modified key line with a unpowered pump. And when we started doing that, then the questions became even more interesting, because now in a broad scale regenerative project, like afforestation a place which is degraded, you can't actually be on the land all the time and see each of the aspects of the land. So then I had to work out these things, and I started looking at the different research papers scientists have done, and I started modeling them piece by piece. And that's how the regenesis started.
So basically, when you realized observation works when you're on the land on a small piece of land every day, you can be there a few decades and you have a pretty good understanding of what's happening. But as soon as you start talking about larger scale, of course, you cannot be there and you cannot see every acre constantly. And so then modeling and calculations come in. And did you, when you dove into that world, was there a lot already? What did you find basically in the scientific world?
So the information was in silos. So someone would be doing a study for a certain aspect, like what happens when we have this much of fertilizer with this much of water, and the other guy would be doing in a different way. I had to connect all of these different pieces together, just like an engineer integrates. Engineer basically just does a system integration in a broad sense. So I was just integrating different components together and seeing, okay, this makes sense, and this makes sense. So let's connect these three together. Let's see what happens. Let's calculate the overall impact. My diploma with the Greek medicine helped me a lot, because in Greek medicine, you actually look at things on a physical perspective rather than a chemical perspective and start connecting those things. So permaculture with that helped me connect those things together, and then the engineering background helped me do so quantitatively. So the left and right brain, right side of the brain were both working, the creative side and the analytical side.
And did you find anybody else or others doing the same, like approaching the water cycle side from an engineering perspective and a modeling and calculation? Like, okay, let's see what this actually means in practice and on paper.
There might be some guys, but when I was looking at it, I couldn't find anyone. So that's how the Regenesis was born. That's how I started doing it. It was more out of necessity for myself, because I had to clarify my concepts, and then I started writing about it.
And that's how the Substack Regenesis, which I will definitely put in the show notes below, not to be confunded with the book of George Monbiot. It's a re with an R and a 3, because Regenesis with an E was already taken. But it's an amazing Substack, absolutely deep dive on water cycles, restoration, calculations, and more. And I remember discovering it or stumbling upon it, I think, through the work of Alpha Low, and somewhere mentioning or that circle, let's say, of people, probably the articles he published on Spain. So how did that trigger your attention? Because you're in Islamabad, you're definitely not nearby the Iberian Peninsula, but it's an interesting place. What triggered you saying, okay, let's look at Valencia in Spain, and what happened to the summer rains, and what could potentially trigger them to come back?
That's very interesting. Actually, I was sitting one day and I got a message from Alpha, and he said, "Can you look at these things? I have a meeting with some people in Spain and Portugal, and we are looking at restoring back the rain cycles." And he was referring to Mayan's work as well. So I'm familiar with
a message that
work.
Once gets like, oh, I'm trying to bring back rains. Of course, those are messages we get every day. in your cycles, it's a normal message, but.
Yeah, he said, "Can you do some calculations?" And I said, "I haven't really thought about this thing, but let me look into it. I can do some numbers. Give me
nice
some time."
challenge.
Yeah, so he gave me like 3 days. He said, "I have a meeting in 4 days." So I said, "Give me 3 days, and by the end of 3 days, I'll do it. I'll find some way." And then I started working on it. I think I started connecting different aspects. So basically, now that I look back, it's a little bit more easier to understand what the process is. Then I was totally blank at that time. But anyway, I started working on the aspects. Okay, so what are the basic factors which cause a rain? Broadly, basically, we have 3 types of rain. Everyone basically knows it's a very simple phenomena. So there are convective rains, then there are the orographic rains, and then the third one is the frontal rains, rainfall because of the 2 fronts colliding.
And the other 2, just for people that don't know, just to
so the convective rain is basically
son.
The convective rains are basically rainfalls which basically do because of the evaporation rising up in the atmosphere and then condensing upon reaching a certain height. In case of plants, you can actually enhance that aspect by having bioaerosols and certain other conditions like increasing the decreasing the wind speed so that the clouds can actually form. They're not wind sheared. Having a certain amount of energy in the atmosphere so that the convection can actually take place, and it isn't stopped by lack of energy, so i.e. the water vapor cannot rise. Which I'll go in this aspect a little bit more, but the second one is the orographic rain, which is mostly people are aware of that thing. Winds are coming, moist winds are coming from coast. They hit a mountain, which is basically oro, is for the mountain rock. It hits them and rises up because of that obstacle, and as it rises up, it condenses
And falls. Yeah.
and falls. And the third one is when you have two fronts, so you might have wind coming from a coastal area, and then and there's a cold front coming from the other side. The cold front and the warm front collide together. The cold front pushes the warm front to rise up in that atmosphere, and condensation takes place. So in Spain, I was looking at these things. So I had to look at the winds. Where are the winds mostly coming from? And where are the places which are most opportune for orographic effect? It's easier to start off with the orographic rainfall because if you have landscape which is already at a certain height, you can actually add plantation or just improve. Even in the absence of big vegetation, you can add soil soil improvements which have moisture in them and introduce spores, because spores can actually act as biogenic aerosols.
Spores,
Yeah.
So you're saying it's easier to start with a landscape that already lends itself because there's a hill system or a mountain system that pushes up the air naturally to the height it's needed, and then you can add vegetation on strategic places to increase that effect, basically, or to help the clouds coming in from the coast, because the coast should not be too far away.
Yeah, so you want that moisture, a certain amount of moisture in the air, so that it can reach that saturation point. And as the height increases, saturation point decreases, so condensation occurs. So I looked at all the places which are basically at a certain height in Spain. So I was looking at a 500 meters height. So any places in Valencia which were there, that were the first targets for that. And then at the top of the hill, and generally, if you don't have enough moisture and you have high wind speeds, the clouds will disperse because of the wind. So you need something over at the top, sort of like a ridge forest, sort of like something which actually stops that wind from breaking the clouds from forming. So that's why you have ridge plantations, and you can have ridge plantations which actually add moisture, plus they also stop the wind from coming in. That combined together, that brings a condition in which you have the aerosols from the forests, and then you have the aerosols from the spores that you might have added in the soil impediments, and then you have the extra moisture, and the wind is stopped by these things. So the first thing is looking at these areas. Then the second thing, if you have spots in the land which are, let's say, very hot because of asphalt or concrete cities or stuff like that, even rocky places, just try to reduce that temperature on that land, because if you have a very high temperature on the ground and a low temperature at the top, the clouds will rise and they will leave your space. There will be no localized rain. Even if you add moisture, the rain will be in the high cloud systems, which will probably so Spain is evaporating its water, and the rain happens in somewhere else, like 1,000 kilometers away.
Central Europe, basically, as we saw. Yeah.
So basically you're losing
rain somewhere else.
Yeah, you're losing your water to someone else. It's basically now it's gone into a large water cycle. So
you want to keep it local, and you were able, or you started looking at this and see, how do we quantify this? Like, where in the system of Valencia, let's say, how much do we need, or how much is already there?
So just check. Yeah, so for that you just find out what's the relative humidity in your area, and whatever the difference is, you have to fill that difference with some way of evaporating
Yeah. So what's the humidity already, and
Yeah,
should the humidity get to in order to trigger
yeah.
rain?
In Mediterranean, it's about 20 grams per centimeter cube, which is from Mayan's research. So that's a
Sorry, that's about Mian said it was about 7. No, what's the
20 grams per
20
centimeter
grams
cube.
per?
Yeah.
And
So
what's the relative humidity? What was the relative humidity in Valencia in the summer?
we basically, I generally look at it in terms of total column water vapor. So you have 20 grams. It's equivalent to some. I don't remember the exact figure in terms of relative humidity, but for me, I just look at the total column water vapor in an area, and then find the ET that is needed for covering that deficit, the extra evaporation that you need to cover that deficit.
And then how do you make it concrete then? How do you transform that into we need X amount of hectares of trees or square kilometers of etc.?
So, as I told you before, then you look at the places which are like about 500 meters. They are places which you should be looking at first, because from the ET you can actually find out how many trees per hectare you need. From the trees you can find out the ET rate of a tree, what's the evaporation rate of a tree. You can also have that same amount by using evaporation towers, uh, or just evaporating water, or just having coastal winds come in.
Yeah, we had
They can
Jesus
be,
on the
yeah,
podcast, which
Jesus.
should be out soonish. Yeah, so there are different
Yeah,
ways of covering that gap,
that
basically.
deficit. Yeah, yeah.
The deficit. And when you did that for there, did it sound like an impossible amount or a possible? Like, what was your first
No,
reaction when you
not
saw the
there was
numbers?
not much difference. So if you look at that, there's probably like 600 or 300 square kilometers. Let me pull out my Substack. I don't exactly remember the numbers.
No, of course, because you do so many of these.
It was about from 300 to 600 kilometers for 20% increase in rain.
For a 20% increase in range, you said.
Yeah.
Wow. And so it's interesting also when you look at these places where it's relatively close, like the gap is small between, but there's still no rain happening because you need to read it. Like it's a very binary system. Like it needs to hit a certain amount of humidity, otherwise it doesn't rain. And if you're just below it, it just blows away and rains somewhere else. But also figuring out where the delta is the smallest could be like where's the leverage point, where's the easiest to influence the evaporation enough to actually trigger rains. So you did that in a few days. You sent it to Alpha, and then what happened? You also put it on your Substack immediately.
Yeah. So I told Alpha that this is basically a baseline criteria. So if I visit that place and I look at those areas and I have exact data, then I can improve it like much more than that. I can be very exact in that. I call this baseline because I just looked at the topography of Spain, and just some spaces I just found out the places which were a little bit higher in elevation, and just found out the total area which is forested and how much is the current total column water vapor on average in Valencia. On average, because I don't have that exact. But what you are saying is when you have that exact number, you can actually pinpoint. That's another factor when you can actually use. So with the places which have the least amount of deficit, that those should be the places which should be forested uh, in the first step.
And then does it matter how it's forested? Because they're forest and forest. Like what are you using in terms of calculation, in terms of evaporation rate of trees, healthy forest versus plantation?
So generally, I was looking at 5 millimeter per day of trees. So the Jatropha and trees like this eucalyptus, they are generally in that range. But it doesn't really matter which trees are you using, because a certain place can be more suited for a certain type of tree. Just look at trees which evaporate a lot of water. According to that area, don't focus on eucalyptus or Jatropha only.
Focus on the trees that evaporate a lot
Focus
and
on the
are
trees.
able to because they might need to be irrigated. They might need to be, especially if the water cycle is broken, you need to figure out how to do that over time, long enough to get the rain back, so you don't rely on. It would be a shame if you're depleting an aquifer to seed the rain, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. For there's another aspect which I didn't mention in the Spain project, but before you do any kind of afforestation work, you need to find out what's the water potential of that land, which doesn't mean uh, the winds which are bringing in the moisture, it actually means how much water is underground, how much water is flowing on the land. I just did a calculation for Panama Canal recently. I haven't put it on the blog.
I was thinking I
It
didn't see
was
it. Yeah, because of the
it,
droughts
it
recently and the
yeah,
level of
because
the
of the
Panama
droughts
Canal.
and the lack of water in the Panama Canal. So there I didn't even look at the forestation. I just looked at the base flows which are in a certain area. So because the base flows are actually feeding that Panama Canal, the Cartoon Lake. So I was looking at the base flows and how to enhance the base flows. For there I was using a different technique, not forestation, because in the Amazon there are some basins which were in the Panama, there were some basins which were 98% forested, and still there was a lot of runoff. So you have to go in a different way there. You have to find out the frequency of the rainfalls, which are the wet months, and what's actually happening in the dry months. So the lake was
And so, what technique did you pick?
yeah. So it was borewell harvesting in that space. So you need microspores. Actually, I was just looking at that data, and there was a basin in which there was some indigenous people living, and they had wells. In that basin, there were a lot of base flow and very little runoff, compared with the adjacent basin, which is nearly the same amount of forested. It was also 98% forested, but it had very high base flows. So I did some digging and found out that the macrospores were responsible for the additional base flows.
The microspores? What do you mean by that?
Macropores.
Micropores.
Sorry.
So basically
wells. They had
so
the
it
wells
rained
and
the
the
same
wells.
amount in the two basins. It was the same forested, but they had a completely different runoff, which means something else is happening there.
Yeah. So they had in that space, I calculated how much bore wells will I need to dig in this areas to increase the base flows.
So meaning basically in the dry period you would take water from below, from the aquifer, from below water.
So it basically means
why would you dig?
Okay. So it basically is like this. So
again,
the rainfall is occurring.
7-year-old son. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm going in that way. So it's like this. The rainfall is occurring, and the basin has a lot of slopes, like 40-degree slopes. Despite having a lot of forest, 98% covered, the sheer topography of the land is actually forcing the water to run off.
Because it's super slopey.
It's super steep. But the adjacent basin had wells in it, and that extra water would actually go directly in the well.
So it's to go down. So they were basically
increasing the groundwater level
again. How do you infiltrate?
Yeah.
So trees weren't enough to help.
Yeah, trees were not enough in that case. On that side. On the other side, you need trees. On the other side of the Panama, in the Rio Trinidad, you need trees for that.
But this is a fascinating piece again, because I don't know if people follow the news. I haven't done it deeply enough, but I think the Panama Canal has been reduced drastically, like the amount of ships that could go through it. I don't know if it changed recently, but it's a massive cost to Panama because less ships means less money, and to the global economy because they have to go around. Like if they're too heavy or too deep, they basically cannot pass. And anybody that has ever looked at a map knows that going around is an interesting trip. Not only because of what you're going to burn to do that, but also because of cost and time. And that's all because of water management, basically. If they have more stable water levels, then they can run the canal as they used to.
So coming back to our question, so you had to look at the water potential of that land by seeing the rainfall and the slopes of the land, and then manage that rainfall potential, because that's the key thing. The amount of water you can harvest from the land, and basically forests are basically sort of like a rainwater harvesting structures, much more advanced than what we do, but in an engineering term, they are doing the same function. They are just acting as shock absorbers, as water tanks, as infiltrators, putting in dampers in the system, putting that water in the ground. and evaporating it. So rainwater harvesting, just look at the rainwater harvesting. So in case of Valencia, the first thing that should be done is either do some sort of a keyline, modified keyline thing with borewell harvesting, so that you can actually raise the groundwater whenever it rains. Minimize the runoff as much as you can, and then move on from there. Because once you have the water in the land, then you don't have that problem that you have to waste a whole lake to just grow the crops, grow the forest, and then expect rain in the end.
So the first step is really to
Yeah,
have more water in the land.
Yeah.
And so what were the reactions, or like you've opened your Substack, you started it last year. I mean, this we're recording in October 24 and you started it in December, I think end of the year 23. How's been the Substack ride, let's say? What have you, as you expected, different, more interesting, more relevant? Like has your journey of writing about this publicly and being very active on LinkedIn as well, like how's that been?
I did not expect that people would be seeing that, because it was mostly my own sort of, I was doing it for myself. Even now when I do something, I am actually trying to find answers for myself, and I just started posting it for everyone, so that maybe someone else can benefit as well. So most of the content I still do is free. Mostly 90% is still free, although I'm starting to feel now that I have little less and less time. But anyway, I still try to keep it that way.
And are you planning to turn it into more of a business model or a job, like as some Substacks have done and others, of course, have not? Like, what's your thinking there, or is it mainly also your sort of public notebook of the work you're doing, what you find interesting, and if it's great if other people read it, but it's not the fundamental driver?
Yeah, it's kind of like I had some funds and I've actually dried those funds while I was doing this thing. So I'm looking for a sort of like an economical model which can actually support me as well. But I'm still in two minds whether to go with the same way, more of the content free and very little parts uh, on charge. But let's see. I'm still figuring that out. Haven't figured that
And
yet.
are you looking for like the consultancy side, or what would be your ideal job or work in this space?
My ideal job, I think I would. I'm actually working with some with a few guys, not exactly in this as you would say paying capacity right now, but we are building some Earth engines which will have all of these things, not only the water aspect but the other aspects as well, of the biosphere, the anthroposphere, the geosphere, lithosphere, cryosphere, connecting all of these things together, and then finding out the uh, missing pieces that are not being checked right now in the modeling, and putting those missing pieces in. We'll probably be using some kind of generative AI to fill in the gaps for the data.
And what is the use case, or what is the reason to do that beyond water? Why to do?
The use case is that if you, for example, if you see a place like, for example, let's say I don't remember the figures in Europe what happened right now, but I'll just take the 2022 floods in Pakistan, which is about, the governor saying like it was like $4 billion plus of damage.
Yeah. That's probably underestimated. So
Yeah, probably
it's easily
underestimated.
eight. But yeah.
So if you have something like this, which can actually find out the tipping points based on the landscape, climate, bioregion, you can actually use it as a dashboard and put it in front of the policymakers that the next time, if this much rain occurs, this is going to be the damage, and then you can actually force them to do the regenerative work on a scale
Force
which
is a nice word. I mean that has the assumption in it that if you show the data to people, they will act. which is not always the case, but I think some people will and some people won't. But you're saying with these kind of absolutely devastating floods, because I don't know, people remember in 2022, but it was a massive floods in Pakistan. And I think the ones you're referring to now in Europe, there were just some in Central Europe, mostly Austria, I think Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc. There were some massive floods also connected to, and if you go to LinkedIn, you'll find some interesting places connected to a very hot Mediterranean Sea over the summer. Of course, all the records were broken again. And the moist didn't go anywhere. I mean, it stayed above, didn't rain, and moved basically in a nice big circle. You can actually see it from satellite imagery, and then stayed because it was pushed by a northern front. It sort of stayed put for a few days above Central Europe, and of course, if it stays put, it starts to rain. It just didn't move anymore. The ones in Pakistan in 22, have you done some modeling or some calculation of where that occurred from? Like, where did the moist come from, and why was it so devastating?
It was basically of the La Nina effect. But if I look at that, even though people say they were devastating, and even though effects were devastating, if you look at the amount of rainfall that was happening, that was not a lot of rainfall. The only problem was this, that there was no land to actually infiltrate that water. And I actually did
like you said at the beginning,
I did a study on that, and I just found out that if a certain amount of this riverine ecosystem is established, there will never be a flood like this. Even if the flood is increased by 5 times, even then it will absorb that rain. I did that in, it's probably 72, number 72 on Regenesis. So it's generally, I have found that it's generally not the amount of rainfall that's the problem. Mostly the problem is the amount of land that we have degraded or misused in a way that cycles are broken and floods are happening.
And so you're thinking, if we present this, and I will put those 72 and 73 in the show notes as well, your examination of the Pakistan floods into parts. If you show this data and with this engine to policymakers and say, look, it's way cheaper to treat these and these pieces of land, or this part of Pakistan in this case, then we will never have a flood like that again. That would potentially create policy or potentially create movement, because it has never been presented in that way. Is that what's missing? Like a good, easy way of presenting, in this case, cause and effect almost of floods?
Yeah, I think it can be, it can force them, it can actually maybe encourage them to do it like this, but this can also be used another way. For example, World Bank and IMF, they put a lot of money when Pakistan was flooded, inundated, and that money could actually be used not to directly change the landscape, rather than just they can actually put in some mechanisms in which they can, and I'm actually trying to work out that part as well, that you have a dashboard in which you can actually have those things included as well. Anyway, that's still a long way. I just thinking about it.
But it's a very relevant bridge. Let me use it in this way. Like, what does this mean for the financial space and system? And you already mentioned 4 billion, probably more, in terms of damaging. We have heard actually before, when talking about water cycle restoration, that it potentially is better to talk about floods, because it's way more in your face, very costly. It's much more on people's mind than, oh, let's restore the water cycle, the small one, etc. I will put the link to that interview we did with, I'm blank on his name, Oxbury Bank. He founded in the UK, and he was saying, yeah, we need to talk about floods and flood mitigation and flood prevention more than we talk about water cycles, because that's what people are scared about. If you have a data center, if you have a dam, if you have a city, if you have anything downstream from a flood, you're going to be interested in prevention. And so for the financial side, have you done any calculations, any work connecting this work to, let's say, the world of money, dollars, pounds, etc.?
Not in that sense, not exactly, but I did it in the way that, for instance, you are reviving a riverine ecosystem. You can actually have in that riverine ecosystem special zones in which you can actually create microclimates, and you can grow certain cash crops which can actually enable the local people to earn a lot of livelihood. For instance, right now, in Pakistan, normally cotton is grown in these areas, and cotton is like 4,000 or $2,000 uh, per ton. But if you grow saffron, it's about $40,000 per ton. And you can actually create those conditions in a riverine ecosystem inside, where you can actually have that extra bit of money coming in for the people. So that's one thing. But then there is another aspect which is normally which can also be looked into, which is the pollutant load that is actually entering into the rivers. And that pollutant load is actually it converts into greenhouse gases when there's a lot of biological organic oxygen demand, BODs. So when you have a
Okay,
lot
that
of
you need to walk us through that piece by
okay,
piece. I'm pulling my 7-year-old card again.
okay.
I don't know
So
how many I
basically,
get in this interview, but in this conversation, but I've used a few, and I'll probably use a few more.
no problem. So basically, in mostly these developing countries, Pakistan and Africa. I don't know about India, but Bangladesh, etc. Normally, the sewage directly enters the rivers, and when the sewage enters the rivers, it converts that into an open sewage canal, and it's always methane and all of those gases are released from that river, which are actually all greenhouse gases. So if you can actually show a metric to tell someone that this is the amount of carbon that's being greenhouse gases that are being released, and you can actually do a riverine ecosystem in a way which can actually remove those carbon, and as in the case of a carbon offset scheme, you can remove those things. You can actually also earn money from there. I
Basically saying currently the
I
sewage
did
goes
a
directly into the rivers.
104.
It will flow into the air. It will massive methane, carbon, etc. And so there is a potential to leverage that, to stop that,
Yeah,
and somehow not having it go up in the air and potentially earn money on it.
I did 104 on this. It's also part of
Yeah.
repairing the water cycles, because riverine
Yeah, it was
ecosystems
interesting to
actually.
see you write about sewage too. Yeah, I didn't expect that, but makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the current one is a item like ocean exploration. It also connects with that.
I will put it in the show notes. And so I always love to ask this question, and imagine we're doing this in a theater in Islamabad or in the financial heart of Pakistan or the region. We might be in the Middle East or in New York, and the room is full of investors, people that are managing money, either their own or other people's money, maybe pension funds, insurance companies, banks, things like that. And of course, we do this on stage. We have a full evening talking about water cycles, restoration, a lot of pictures behind. People are super inspired. But people also forget. If there was one thing you could, one seed you could plant in their mind and that they remember the next day, preferably when they're back at work and they do something, what would that be? What would be the seed you want to plant in their mind that they remember from an evening talking about what's possible in terms of water cycle restoration?
One seed, as in the case of what's the one thing that they should be doing?
They should remember, yeah. But what should financial people know? I think that's the summary of my long question.
Okay. If I was to say one thing that they should remember, I would say that give the people the use your funds to actually, for example, if you have like $1 billion, spend 500 million on just teaching people how to harvest water. Because once they start doing water harvesting, they'll understand what forests do, and they can build communities around that aspect. They can remove their water shortages, they can feel the abundance, grow food, and whole communities can come together like they did in India in the Pani Foundation. They just taught people how to harvest water, and that changed the whole economy of the people and of the land. They had access water, the people had access food, their lives improved, and they also started caring for the environment, because once you have the abundance, you actually start feeling for the environment. And water harvesting is such an interesting thing that I told you before, it's functionally the same whether you dig a pond or you plant a tree. It's functionally the same. And once people start
We're going
understanding
to
that
upset
thing,
some people now with that. They say, no, but a living system. Like, You say it doesn't matter, you need to capture all the water. Whatever way you use, do it.
Now, I'm saying this is a stopgap solution. Rainwater harvesting is always a stopgap solution when you don't have forests. Eventually, people, when they start seeing that, they will eventually move towards that just by seeing the sheer amount of abundance that rainwater harvesting scheme did to them. So even if someone is in an urban city and he is rainwater harvesting on his roof, it's the same principles. And once he does that, he understands what forests are doing in a desert, and he can connect with that thing conceptually. So that's the first thing that anyone should be doing.
Rainwater harvesting education. That's the
Education
key
and
to
maybe
unlock.
empowering people by tools or techniques or stuff.
But this is not rocket science. Like this is not a.
This is not rocket science.
This has been done. Like if you just look for the Pani Foundation, there are very interesting YouTube videos about the scale. Like I don't think many people know how big their impact has been. I think the count is now. We had Zach Wise on it who mentioned it a few times. I think there's some videos are mentioning 7 rivers came back, but I think they're up to 9 or 10 now. Which is just like from very simple water harvesting techniques done by a lot of people at a large scale. You basically restore year-round water flow through rivers, which changes everything in a landscape, obviously. And then we can start talking about small water cycles. Okay, so that's half of the 1
That's
billion.
half of it.
And
that's
the
half
rest?
of it. So the next 300 billion you should spend in places which are the most opportune places. And by opportune, I mean they have the least amount of forests there. Because when you have a place which is heavily deforested and it has a rainwater potential which supports forests, then you have a lot of opportunity. So I'll just take example of 2 places. You have the Mediterranean. It's about 20% forested, and we have Pakistan here, and it's about 4% forested. Now there's not
like that's 4.0, not 40. That's nothing.
4%. Even less than that. It's probably 3.9 something. But anyway, Pakistan is not a desert per se. There's a lot of rainfall, but all the rainfall goes into the Arabian Sea, just runs off. Nothing is stored. So you have a lot of potential there. And similarly in Mediterranean, if you can put in forests there, you can actually convert the entire landscape, make it an abundant landscape. You can also change the local climate. Pakistan is also probably the third. It's known as the third pole of the world because it has the highest peaks, one of the highest peaks, Karakoram 2, just nearly the same height as Mount Everest, and it also has the lowest point, which is like 20 meters. So the topography is great.
You have the full topography of the world, basically. Yeah.
And it has all, like any place in the world, all of the climate zones are in Pakistan. So you can have a desert and nearly a sort of like a subtropical zone in some places. And then there are 8,000 plus glaciers in Pakistan. But it's also an amazing number. So the amount of opportunity here and showcasing something, you can actually use that model to convince anyone in the world that you can use. Similarly with Mediterranean, because it has a lot of potential because of the amount of the gap between the forests that there could be. And when you look at forests, don't look at them as something which are non-producing things, because you can actually work your way with different vertical producing things. Like you have multiple crops, so one over the other, not like a
you're not saying it should be a forest where this should be a working forest and working trees, production trees. Of course, they're producing in general, but also in terms of food, fiber, oils, etc. So looking at the most opportune places. And now, are you saying or suggesting or meaning that with the computing power we have now and the modeling, that we can actually pinpoint those places? Because I feel that maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago, or I don't know exact number, but it was not possible to say the most opportune. We said it a bit more like, okay, it sounds philosophically right, but I cannot really put a number on it. Mediterranean sounds great. Pakistan, I can see the topography, I can see the potential, I can see the amount of impact because the amount of people there, etc., etc. But now you could actually put a number on it, say, okay, these are the 5 places with the highest potential because of this and these reasons.
You also have Sinai, because Sinai directly influences the Mediterranean climate. So Sinai is also that third place.
Sinai, yeah. We had the weather makers on. Of course, now the region is again in turmoil, and so I don't think a lot is happening in Egypt at the moment, but it will happen at some point. Fascinating potential project there. But are you suggesting we can calculate now and
Yeah,
like, let's say, satisfy your engineering brain?
I think that it will probably be maximum of a year before we can do that. Maximum. That's the maximum limit. Or maybe 2 years.
What is missing?
But I'm pretty sure that what's missing?
Yeah, what's missing now in terms of why can't we do it now yet? Like, what's missing currently?
A couple of things. For example, the bioprecipitation models are not in the climate models as such, and there are certain aspects of and there are certain other aspects which are also, I've not figured them out completely, but many of the other aspects I've seen in the models that are not. For example, the grid size of the climate models is too large to account for bioprecipitation and natural regeneration aspects.
Sorry, also, what does it mean in plain language, in plain English?
It basically means that when the data is being taken from the land, they are using a space of 5 square kilometer by 5 square kilometer,
which is too big to
which is too big to cover everything. It covers the general circulation patterns. Plus, there are other aspects which are, some of the factors in the climate models are taken as inputs, as for example the general circulation patterns. But there's more research coming in which is showing that the forest can actually change the general circulation patterns as well, with the biotic pump and all of those things. So once those things are in place, and secondly the data problem, we don't have the data for everything right now. But with the AI coming up and the increasing complexity of the models, those gaps can be filled. And once those gaps are filled, you can actually pinpoint the exact locations where you would need certain things to change the climate. It would eventually go into a geoengineering sort of a space from natural regeneration. But this is something we have to live with.
It's our only hope, probably. Yeah, the natural geoengineering side of things. What's the risk there? Like, do you feel a risk, sense of risk, like with these extremely powerful models and prediction? What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, that's why the climate change climate change has to happen from the hearts first. The hearts have to become less greedy, because any information can actually be used as a tool for warfare. Any good thing can be converted into a weapon.
And so, of course, if you can start changing weather patterns and things like that, yeah, there will be ways we figure out how to use it against other people. Yeah, probably less so compared to geoengineering. Yeah, and
yes, because forests can actually produce their own rainfall, so it will be dangerous, but not too dangerous as maybe cloud seeding directly.
Yeah, it should bring a lot more abundance and stability in theory. But yeah, in practice, we have to see. But that will be a problem we can figure out once the abundance is clear and happening, which we're clearly not anytime soon at the moment. And if you could change one thing overnight, if you had a magic wand, so we take away your 1 billion investment fund, but you do have the magic power or the power to change one thing, which could be consciousness, get rid of subsidies or not, like, could be literally anything. What would that be?
In terms of climate change?
Or in general, completely free.
Oh.
We've had really diverse answers from like subsidy schemes to all animals outside, to global consciousness, to better taste for people when they taste food, like full spectrum, let's say, you can choose from, but you have only one. So that's the only limitation.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. So I had a couple of things coming in my mind and I just lost all of them. But anyway, I'll try to answer this question.
Take your time.
For me, the first thing that you, uh, the only thing that we should be doing, the one thing that we should be doing is looking at everything as if it is part of us. It's an extension of us, and we are extension of it. Think of ourselves as part of the whole scheme, not as someone like. Don't extract anything without thinking that you will not have a opposite reaction to that. So use everything in a just and equitable way, even if it's the resources from Earth or is your relation with other people.
I think it's a really good answer to the magic wand question. And as a final one, inspired definitely by John Kemp, if you like, where are you contrarian? What do you believe to be true about regenerative agriculture, or let's say regeneration of water cycles, that others don't believe to be true? No, that's actually like, where are you contrarian in your thinking within your group, like within maybe the water cycle group, or maybe within the regeneration movement? Where are you thinking differently?
I think that basically the tipping points and the climate, whatever the limits of the Earth that we have, these are the limits of the industrialized extractive system. They are not the limits of natural regeneration systems. So we can actually use those limits, tipping points, to come back to a methodology which is more inclusive, which actually enhances the natural ability of the soil and natural ability of the ecosystems, because we haven't really seen the full capacity of the natural ecosystems occurring in unison, coming together to usher in an era which is sort of like not degrowth, but more like a regrowth sort of a thing.
So we're only scratched the surface of potential, and people can see it because we're all living in degraded lands, basically. Like, it's not that we have a lot of examples where we can see the potential or the abundance.
And this is one point where I have a lot of problem talking to people, because normally when people talk about climate change, they are mostly looking at things in a very black and white way. Okay, these are the tipping points and we are over consuming, so we'll die and everything will finish. And they're not taking into account the capacity and capability of the earth, of the natural systems, to actually come and help us and teach us ways in which we can actually enhance those limits. But those limits must be understood, because those limits tell us that this system cannot go on for long the way we are doing things right now. So we have to change our ways.
But it doesn't mean that there couldn't be other systems that could go on and beyond.
But it doesn't mean that you have to stop everything and degrowth everything. It just means you have to look into the.
I think it's a perfect way to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Ali, for first of all the work you do. I hope many more people join your Substack, paying as well. People, come on, and for coming on here and explaining and sharing what is already possible, what will be possible soon, with more and better modeling and more computer power, and of course with more people focusing on it. And I'm looking forward to following you and following the work you do, and see. Hopefully, you'll be joined soon by more people with an engineering mindset and modeling capacity to go deep in regeneration and water cycles, because we need it. We cannot rely on Ali alone, and we need more of these calculations. So thank you so much. And then, of course, having people to put it into practice, because it's great to have ideas and put it in front of people, and great plans. But if we don't translate that into action on the ground, we're going to be left in the misery as we are now. But thank you so much for coming on here, for explaining. Sorry for the many interruptions as a 7-year-old, but I think we needed to explain and share some of the pieces for the audience, and for myself mostly, because of course the audience is way smarter than I am, but I need to have some explanations every now and then.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's no problem. I know I can get a bit carried away sometimes with the concepts. Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's super complex and we need to explain, like there's that bridge is needed. And so I'm happy to play my small part in that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again and see you next time.